Ladies and gentlemen, we are mere weeks away from the launch of the Carrot Corner subscription video service. This is a new educational cash game poker video library featuring new content from me and a bunch of very strong poker players and coaches that I have sourced to bring you the highest quality cash game content that I possibly can. We are launching sometime in mid-April. We'll be giving you a date very soon, but for today, we are showcasing episode number 1 of my brand new course that features on there, and that course is called True EV. We've gone and we've done it. We've named a course over what actually matters in poker. We're going to be making our way through the game of No Limit Hold'em cash games, looking at spots by theme and learning what really matters in each of them. And you're going to get to watch episode 1, which is all about how to play a strong hand against what you deem to be a strong range and maximize your EV in real life. You're going to be able to watch that right here, right now, for free on YouTube. But that's not all. To celebrate this subscription service that's coming your way soon, we're doing an Easter sale. You get 25% off everything site-wide at Carrot Corner from Good Friday all the way through to Easter Monday. Go ahead and check out at carrotcorner.com. Massive savings. What's not to love? But hey, watch this first. This is a free sample of True EV. Hope you like it. Let me know what you think. And happy Easter. Make sure that you don't eat too much chocolate. Carrots are better for you. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the start of a brand new series here on carrotcorner.com. This is True EV, and I've been excited to bring you this series for quite some time. We're going to be going over spots in thematic ways. We're going to start today by looking at situations where you have a strong hand against a strong range and how to maximize here. I thought it was only fitting that we begin with the Jack-9 of clubs, which of course, if you know me well, you'll know that this is my favorite starting hand. Not actually my favorite starting hand is aces, but Jack-9 of clubs is like my little pet hand. I'd still rather have aces though. Sorry, Jack-9 of clubs. So we get into a really cool situation here where we have a strong hand against what appears to be a strong range. I'm going to show you the importance of hand reading in spots like this and how to maximize what you can win in such situations. We're going to get into this momentarily. But first, let me explain to you a few of the mission statements, the ethos, if you will, the philosophy itself of True EV. What does True EV mean, and why are we making this video series? Well, True EV is a term that refers to the expected value of a play in the real world. And this can be against your opponent or it can be against the pool that you're playing against. So this is a video series on how to pick the most profitable play in real life. Poker is a long journey and it's made up of lots of little micro decisions. Do you raise against this c-bet here? Do you fold the river to this river raise? What sizing should we use on the turn on that flush card? What's the best play against this particular opponent? What's the best play against pool in this spot? There's all of these questions, but together they make up your win rate, your graph, your performance, whether you achieve your poker goals or not. And achieving your poker goals and becoming successful at this game isn't a matter of getting really close to a solver output or understanding the game better than anybody else. It's actually a matter of what you do. Winning in a game post-rake, that's to say having a high enough win rate that you beat the rake, is all about making the best decision every single time. Well, that's impossible, but getting as close to that stretch goal as you can. Can you take the most profitable play way more often than your average opponent? That's what's going to get you beating a game. So this is a video series on how to do that. It's pretty simple. Why is it necessary to teach poker in this way? Why is it necessary to remind people that there is a thesis about maximizing your expected value in every spot that you're in? It's necessary because people miss the mark these days. People get bogged down in GTO, solver output, echoes of things that people they respect in the game have said to them, stuff their buddy said to them the other day. There's all this stuff going on. Your head can be swimming with all of these confusing concepts, but at the end of the day, many of them don't actually describe what the best thing is to do with the cards you currently have with your hand against the range and strategy of your opponent. So here, my friends, is the True EV thesis before we get started. This is the primary premise of the True EV thesis. When your opponent is a human, one of your options is almost always better than the others. That's to say it would be a massive coincidence if all of your options just had the same EV. But in a solver, this is default in many spots. You might look at whether to size the turn 60%, 80%, 100% pot, or 150% pot. And the solver might just say that the current hand that you have is indifferent between all of those options. And you should look at that with a great deal of suspicion because that's false in the real world. In the real world, your opponent's strategies are not the same as the solver strategy. They get stuff wrong. They're unbalanced in almost every situation that you ever play. Even if you're playing against a strong reg, they're still really far from an optimized strategy unless they're cheating with RTA, God forbid. So what that means is that it's on you to make sure that you genuinely ask yourself the question of which of your options is better, because one is very, very likely to be better than the others. It would be hugely coincidental if they were all the same as they are in the solver. As coincidental as my chair weighing exactly the same as your chair, or my garden having the same number of blades of grass as yours. These weird coincidences, while they do exist, are few and far between. And your options, your plays, your lines having the same EV in the real world against a human are just like that. It could happen, but it's really unlikely. So we should always start by assuming one play is better than the others. Finding this play is a matter of considering how to play your hand, not your range, but your hand. When you're learning the theory of poker, you'll see solvers care about strategies, collections of plays with different combos in their range. They'll care about that for one very good reason. Their strategy is completely transparent to an all-powerful opponent, another solver, and they play billions of hands in this transparent environment. But your strategy is opaque. Your human opponents can't see what you're doing. They only catch a little glimpse of that at showdown, or maybe over the long haul with HUDs or remembering your rough frequencies. But overall, they're quite clueless as to what your true strategy really is. And so they're not going to be able to exploit you. You don't need to have the same fears that a solver has when it's worried about being exploited. Playing your hand is very, very important, because the cards you have right now, those are the only cards that affect the EV of your current decision. To do something with your hand because of some other part of your range is to really causally misunderstand what's going on. It's to take a random and irrelevant action. But so often I see poker students worry about their range, their frequencies, their strategies, and not actually ask what's best for my hand against my opponent's range or strategy. The predicted strategy of your opponents, and that could mean an individual human if you know your opponent really well, but more commonly, it means the pool's range and strategy. If you know how people that fit a rough profile, and that could just be 25 NL player on X site, or it could be even vaguer than that, it could just be poker player, human poker player, or it could be more specific, it could be like recreational poker player at a certain stake on a certain site. But whatever that population is, you can figure out roughly what they're doing on average, and there will be outliers, and that's okay, but you can figure out roughly what people are doing, and you can tailor your line with your current hand to that. That's what we should be doing. The ingredients for executing this thought process of playing your hand against the opponent's predicted range and strategy on average are the following. First off, we need some awareness of how a spot is roughly played in theory. If you are the small blind on 6-5-4 in a single raise pot, and your pre-flop raise has been called by the big blind, having some idea that you don't get to do a lot of betting, that's better for the big blind, that big blind enjoys what we call an EV advantage in the Carrot Poker School, is paramount to understanding that spot, to knowing the lay of the land. But you also need to ask yourself other things as well. You need an awareness of how the opponent or pool's range and strategy is unbalanced. So if you check, for example, on 6-5-4, small blind versus big blind, having some idea that people use X sizing a lot, or when they bet they have a certain range composition, these things are really important. So if you know, for example, that when you c-bet there, you don't get raised enough, and you have quite a flimsy hand with something going for it, already you can begin to predict that betting performs better than it does in the solver, and you might reject the solver's idea of check folding that hand in that spot, because your human opponents at 25 NL or 50 NL or whatever stake you play are not reacting properly to the bet. That's just an example. This applies in every single spot you can possibly imagine. Thirdly, you need an understanding of how to maximize EV by exploiting the imbalance with your current hand. So we just kind of did that, right? If you have Jack 10 on 6-5-4 and you think that if you check, you will have to check fold to a bet. You think a bet is coming relatively frequently, and you think that if you bet, you'll get lots of folds, lots more folds than you should in theory, and less raises, then you should bet that Jack 10. That's an example of figuring out the true EV of a play. And we're always trying to take the best play right here, right now. Remember, that's the point. And finally, we need the willingness not to use or copy blindly GTO solver lines and strategies where we don't think that they maximize EV. Now, you will see me teach with solvers sometimes. You will see me use solver outputs in the theory course, the Carrot Poker School, because understanding how poker ought to be played in the objective, you know, what the sort of laws of physics are that determine EV going up and down in a battle between two perfect strategies, that's really valuable. And you can extrapolate a lot of lessons from that. But just taking that and copy and pasting it into real play is a huge blunder. And in my opinion, that is the thing that is holding back the most aspiring poker players right now from achieving their goals. I don't think it's the games are really tough, the rake is really unreasonable. While these things are true to more of an extent than they used to be, I think the reason that people are really struggling now more than ever at poker is that the way they're learning and the things they're prioritizing is just plainly wrong. And we didn't even have this problem so much before the solver era. Like, sure, we had irrelevant thought processes that people were spouting, but we didn't have such a widespread, large-scale delusion of what's important like we have now. So please don't think that I'm denouncing solvers entirely or that I'm saying you should never study theory. Not at all. What I'm saying is that when you're in a hand, you have to focus on true EV, and having read and understand and listened to the true EV thesis, I hope that every hand we talk about in this video series from now on, you're going to be able to see it in that light, and this is going to be your mindset. All right, let's get into the hands. Let's get started. Okay, so our journey begins with the Jack-9 of clubs. Just to remind you how we got here, we opened the cutoff to 2.2. We were 3-bet by a recreational player in the big blind. I remember having that read here. And these hands all come from the 100 Russian cash challenge, which is where my volume challenge is beginning. And that's going to be accelerating a bit more this year in 2024. So this hand was played not too long ago. It's quite fresh in my head. I remember here the opponent betting half pot on the flop, which, you know, this is a board that big blind will check a fair bit on an equilibrium. So in GTO, there's not going to be like a range bet situation here or whatever for half pot. Half pot's an okay sizing to use here. It's not really a big deal either way. And our hand is probably going to play mostly call, and it's going to play some raise. I would imagine that would be the theory of the spot. The bigger villain sizing, the less this hand is going to get raised. But the true EV here is that when an opponent 3-bets you from the big blind, right away their range is really, really different to that of a solver. And we can tell this is a recreational, by the way, from this really tiny sizing. You won't see a solver use this sizing in the big blind. You'll see it go to 12 big blinds or 11 big blinds, or even like 13 or 14 in some sims. And this range is going to be constructed in a really kind of sloppy linear way. So there won't be the Jack 5 suited or Ace 5 off or whatever some of the lower equity bluffs are meant to be. These are going to be there at a way lower frequency, and instead we're going to see a higher concentration of bigger cards and bigger pairs. This is how recreational players really construct their big blind 3-bet range. So right away, we already know on this board that villain is connecting with this harder than usual, has a stronger range than usual, and while they do have probably more combos of ace king, which is a really bad hand on this flop, with the exception of that, their range is equity driven. Even ace queen or king queen has some kind of straight draw. Jacks, 9s and 8s are sets. Of course, these are really unlikely with our blockers here. This is a situation where blockers do have a more meaningful impact than normal. But yeah, villain's range is going to be loads of overpairs, loads of combos like pocket 10s that are just really equity driven, and some top pair combos and stuff like that as well. So the air here is going to be few and far between when they bet half pot. And so slow playing, we need to understand that the normal benefit of slow playing a hand in GTO, the reason that a solver will think that call is a viable option here, is that the opponent's range contains quite a lot of low equity bluffs, and that those low equity bluffs are going to be barreling at some frequency later. So the solver is expecting its opponent to take a hand like king 10 or king queen and actually triple barrel until they're all in with combos like that. And what that's going to do is really incentivize us to slow play big hands in order that we may maximize our profits against the bottom of that range. In reality, we expect low EV bluffs not to be very abundant in the first place, and we expect people to have more equity, more medium mergy hands when they bet like this. A solver's going to take a hand like pocket aces here and slow play with it and check it sometimes, but in reality, your recreational opponents are going to fast play most of their overpairs because they prioritize protecting equity and just stopping you drawing over going for check raises or anything fancy like that. So in the real world here, we're actually facing a fairly strong equity-driven range, and we should just be fast playing because there are many ways here that we can fail to get all of this money in the middle. For example, if villain checks the turn, which they will quite frequently, by the way, with hands that are calling flop raises, like pocket kings or pocket aces or something like that, turn could be a jack, a 9 and 8, a 10, a 7 or a queen, and all of these cards are very likely to slow the opponent down to some extent at quite a high frequency. And furthermore, they're very unlikely to be bluffing us on 4-liners and cards like that. Even on a brick turn, I think they're pretty unlikely to get anywhere near the level of aggression that a solver will apply, knowing that its range contains all these value hands and knowing that it has to bluff at a certain frequency. So what we're dealing with here is a situation where raising becomes way better than calling. And if I don't raise this flop, I think I'm already going severely wrong. And you might look at this and think, no, you're dramatizing this, call is fine, clearly call is okay, you're in position, the SPR isn't that big. And while all of these things are true, I really do think that raising here is mandatory. So you can see that through the lens of true EV, what we're doing is we're starting with the assumption that raising and calling don't have the same EV. So when you say it doesn't matter what you do, you can raise or you can call, you're effectively saying that your garden and mine have the same number of blades of grass, and that should strike you as deeply suspicious. And it is. It's almost impossible. And so if we accept the first premise of the true EV philosophy, which is that the options aren't equal, we're now highly incentivized. There's now a carrot on a stick, if you'll forgive the pun, that we can chase after. That's an unforgivable pun, don't forgive it, but you get the point. There's a real incentive now to try and work out which line is better. If you're told that there's money in a box somewhere in your house and it's a lot of money, you're going to go and be incentivized to search for that box of money. If you don't think there's a box of money somewhere in your house, you're not going to go and start rooting about just in case there is one. So the idea here is that the mere assertion that one line is better than the other is all of the catalyst that you should need to start digging. And when you start digging, you start comparing the opponent's true range to what you've learned about the spot theoretically, what ought to happen, and then you reach a verdict about what's better. And that's what we're going to do throughout this series, video in, video out. We're going to keep doing that throughout an array of different spots. So we raise and villain calls. The turn is basically a continuation of the logic on the flop. A really great card for us, does not in any way degrade our two pair, doesn't cause our opponent to start folding over pairs and the like at a massively high frequency. Villain checks, and now again we can decide on a line that's a good fast play here. So I think betting really big here is a good idea. I would make the assumption that a weaker player opponent, a recreational player, is quite unlikely to be that elastic to sizing here and is likely to respond fairly similarly to an array of different sizes. With an overpair, I think fold equity is very low. I would not be happy bluffing this spot. I'd feel very queasy about bluffing the spot with low equity or no equity, because I just think that when weaker players become invested like this, and when an SBR becomes quite low like this, we expect less fold equity than a solver would give us. Not only that, but so many hands in our opponent's range are pair plus draw. So even if they have a fairly weak absolute showdown value holding like pocket 10s or jack 10, it's still going to be very hard for them to fold. Same with 10-9, same with 10-8, all of that sort of stuff. If they have that, they probably don't have a lot of those hands from pre-flop, as discussed. And now there's a flush draw as well, so any jack X of diamonds will not be folding to any sizing, any 9X of diamonds will not be folding to any sizing. If we do get folds here from something like the nut flush draw, that's good for us. You know, that's actually okay because we're cleaning up quite a lot of equity. So the line I actually chose here might not be the absolute best and it might not be necessary. We might be fine here just betting 48 or something like that. But whether we go 48 or go all in, I'm not actually particularly interested in the difference between those because I think it's not so clear. I think this sizing could well be best, by the way. I think all in could well be best. And the idea here is that a weaker player at this SPR is very likely to call this bet with kings or queens or 10s or jack 10 or aces, even some hands like ace jack sometimes. If you ask me, like, what does this achieve? Like, what does it gain that, like, betting 24 or more common sizing wouldn't achieve? The idea is it locks in a ton of money against any of those pair plus draw hands when they're going to brick river, or overpair hands, which are just basically very far behind. Before the river is a 10, a jack, a 7, a queen, a diamond, a card that's going to kill action against those overpairs. So given that overpairs are a very large cluster of the opponent's range, it makes sense that we want to dedicate our play towards EV maximization when villain is holding those hands. And you could say, is that not targeting, Pete? Are you not dead against targeting in your content? And I would say, yes, I'm against targeting small random portions of an opponent's range. So if you said, I'm going to go all in to target the flush draw, I'm going to do this to target the flush draw, that's a very small portion of the opponent's range, but an overpair is a very big portion of the opponent's range based on how this has been played, and not just overpairs, but hands of similar strength. So all in here, I don't think this is that much of a stretch theoretically. I don't think if you look at the EV of all in with this hand, it's going to be that bad compared to betting smaller, because this is a spot where the opponent has a lot of pair plus draw, flush draw, mergey hands. Getting fold equity isn't the end of the world. But in reality, the reason to do this for value never is a bluff. Never go all in as a bluff here. It's terrible. The reason to do this for value is that your opponent's unlikely to be that sensitive to sizing at a low SBR, sort of high level of, you know, feeling committed to the pot. This is a purely mental game thing, being pot committed. I don't believe it. It's a thing technically to just suddenly be unable to fold any hand. That doesn't exist. You always have a folding range in theory against all sizes. But yeah, emotionally, mentally, this is a spot where fold equity is going to be pretty low for all bet sizes. So going big when there are ways that the board can take away your ability to be called later isn't a bad idea at all. You wouldn't want to do this on a run out like king 4 deuce. That would be terrible, because there the sort of more gradual rope-a-dope sort of idea is much better. Just betting a sizing that creates a geometric growth in the pot and allows your opponent to call now and then call a high frequency on the river, and sometimes call a hand once and then fold river that they would have folded to an all-in, right? But here, many of the hands that call the smaller bet also call the all-in, and there are many ways that we fail to get the rest on the river. So this is a way of assessing true EV. So villain does call this time. Villain had ace-9 of diamonds here, so one of the aforementioned like pair plus draw hands that this does very well against. Now this isn't to be results oriented. I'm not sitting here saying, look, he had this hand, therefore this is good. The point is that it's our hand against our opponent's range, and we're doing a full evaluation of that in order to figure out whether we like the play. All right, let's do a couple more examples then. Speeding up a little bit now that we've got the gist. Ace-queen, we go for a 3-bet here. Looks like cut off against under the gun. King deuce-deuce, we go for a small bet, and our opponent calls. The river is the 9 of hearts. We have the ace of hearts here, which theoretically, and a little bit in reality too, helps because we just have more fold equity, and it means that our ace outs are a bit cleaner as well. So if we hit the river now, it can never bring a flush because we block the ace that has the flush draw. So if the river comes an ace, we will never have that top pair on a 3 flush board. We go for a bluff here, which I think is fine. There's obviously a lot of underpairs in the opponent's range here in terms of true EV. I'd say this probably overperforms a little bit. I think a king is going to raise the flop more in reality than it will in theory a little bit. And I also think that hands like pocket eights here are likely to overfold. So I think this is probably just making a bit more money than it does in theory. And I think in theory, it's a totally fine thing to do and it's just optional. And in theory, you can bet or check and it doesn't really matter because the game is rigged, right? Theory is rigged. Solver outputs are rigged. They are the product of an algorithm that seeks Nash equilibrium. So they are literally rigged. It's not online poker sites that are rigged, guys. It's solver outputs. In the real world, you know, we start with the true EV premise that one line is better than the other. And we decide that bet's better than check. So we bet. We're not rolling here. You know, we're not like getting the RNG up and being like 18% of the time we're going to do X. And that's nonsense. That's not how you play poker. That's not going to make you good at the game. It's not going to magically make you money. So here we're deciding that bet is better than check. And that's why we're betting. And on this river, we need to understand something. And that's that our opponent, who was a recreational player, by the way, I'm picking hands specifically against recreational players here, has just called a pot-sized turn bet in a 3-bet pot. We thought that the turn was overfolded. We decided that we thought that hands like pocket eights, pocket tens, pocket sevens, etc. were not calling the turn at high enough frequency. What that means is that if we're right about that, given we block the nut flush draw as well, which is a potential call fold hand, but that's a small point. The big point, the true EV point here, is that if we're right with that hand reading on the turn, we land on a river node where the opponent's range is mostly king X. Now, it may have some higher pairs like jacks and tens in it as well. That means the 10 river's not exactly ideal for us here. But the bigger point is just that we're against the king now pretty often. Now, you could say maybe jam is still good here against certain players. I think against certain regulars and things, jam can still be a fine line here. The problem was that this was a recreational player that very quickly called, as I remember, the turn pot-sized bet. So we opted to give up here. And I think hands like this are now just far too abundant in the opponent's range. So when you have a good hand, the way to deal with a range that's too strong is obviously to put as much money in the pot and fast play and not try to get money from your opponent's bluffs or not take lines that rely on your opponent bluffing to make money, like checking and using tiny bets to induce or anything like that, but just fast playing your hand. But when you have a bluff candidate, the idea is knowing when not to bluff, when to actually give up. And the way I tailor this turn sizing here, the idea is that against a recreational player, when they quickly call a pot-sized bet on the turn, I've learned that my fold equity on the river is pretty low. Not nothing, but too low for any bet size. For example, if I jam, I'm going to need something close to like, I don't know, 63%. It's a bit over 1.5x pot, so something like 63% fold equity seems not quite there against this player. But if I played this against, you know, a tighter reg or something, someone that was scared to stack off deep with top pair, well, now I might be getting folds from all king, queen, and king, jack, and this might be printing, right? So it's very possible against some players that this is winning, but not against recreationals that quickly call turns. So knowing when your opponent's range is too strong in their own mind's eye for you to want the bluff, where you're not getting the fold equity required, is another important true EV skill. So I like the give up here. Pocket tens now, we're in the big blind, we peel ace, king, 10, and we face a big C bet. So there's a few reasons why this is a strong range spot for our opponent. One is just that they opened under the gun, and the under the gun range is just really powerful on boards like this. It's hard to have nothing. You can, of course, have pocket fives, pocket sixes, pocket sevens, but in theory and often in practice, hands like deuces and threes aren't opening under the gun, so you don't have those. You then have to be willing to actually start attacking and blasting under pairs for multiple streets, or jack 10 for multiple streets, or something like that, or pocket jacks or something. You have to be willing to make some really weird looking bluffs here to ever reach anything close to a proper triple barrel bluff frequency. So if we start slow playing here with the 10s on the flop, even though GTO may say, well, they bet big, and that's polarizing their range more, and it's making their value bets really strong, and it means they're likely to bet turn at decent clip, and they're not going to have a mediocre hand like ace queen that you're worried about checking back. In the real world, that's not the case. In the real world, hands like ace queen are really abundant here. They're really likely to check back. Hands like ace 5 are going to bet call the flop sometimes, like horrendous mistakes like that. And a lot of these hands are going to slow down later. And most crucially, you're not worried about costing yourself money against 4s here or 6s here in real life, because most of your opponents in a game like this are not bluffing 6s anywhere near enough on the turn or the river in real life. So here the focus is on fully just getting value from the really good hands in your opponent's range. There are 9 combos of ace king. There are a bunch of combos like ace queen that have a pair and a draw, ace jack that have a pair and a draw. There's some other 2 pair like ace 10, king 10, although we are blocking it quite heavily. Sometimes you run into queen jack, you know, and we're a dog, and we just have to roll with the punches on that one. That's not the end of the world. And sometimes we run into aces and kings. But the point is that if this is a hand that we think is strong enough to start raising for value and putting more money in the pot on non-4 straight runouts, then we should do that, because we shouldn't be relying on our opponent to pot build here, because most of the hands they bet the turn with that we beat are also calling the flop and then calling turn bets, etc. So if villain has ace king here, for example, which is the most abundant hand that we're crushing that's going to pay us off, then while they will bet the turn with that hand, they will also call the flop raise. And then there's all these other hands that call the flop raise that don't bet the turn, like jack 10 and queen 10 and pocket queens and king queen and ace queen and pair plus draws that, you know, villain might not even, he's not even really supposed to be betting big in the first place, in theory, but probably is. So fast playing here seems really, really mandatory to me, regardless of what your solver spits out for this spot. It may well tell you to slow play this hand at a good clip, but don't in reality. In true EV terms, it's worse. Nice big bet, blank turn. Again, we're a substantial favourite here. We are losing to some combos. If we were much deeper than this, we might think about not going for all of the money. But I think at this stack depth against what was a recreational player, we want to. This video is mostly against recreationals, and I think that's important. I think that's a neglected part of poker. So much of your win rate comes from maximising against recreational players, and the less solid somebody is, the more unbalanced they are, the more scope for actually printing a ton of money there is by exploiting. So there's a reason for this. Then on the river, we jam. Yes, we're going to be a slight favourite when called here, maybe a considerable favourite when called here. We're not going to be a huge favourite when called here, but there's no better play than sticking it in for value. If you feel squeamish here and you want to check and call, that's a disaster. If you check here with the intention of calling a bet, or you check because you're bamboozled and then end up calling a bet, that's a disaster either way, because your opponent's going to check back. Some hands that would have paid you off, like king 10 or ace queen. Ace queen calls at some frequency on river, right? Not always. Ace 8. Something like that, ace 6, possibly something, well, ace king being the most abundant example. The opponent calls here with ace king, which is the most common hand that we're going to see combinatorically in this situation compared to any other hand, unless they have queen jack offsuit, which would be kind of a disaster. But some people actually jam the flop with that hilariously, even though there's no need. But anyway, while this is getting semi-thin now, I think at this SPR it's still the right way to play. And if you don't have to have the nuts. If you just have a value, you know, a stack-offable hand for value, if you will, against your opponent's range, you want to fast play that hand instead of check calling down, you know, when they're not bluffing enough and getting stacked anyway. The thing is, if they have queen jack here and we check call down for 3 streets, we don't save any money. We just minimize our profits against ace king while losing the same amount as playing this way. So if you're going to be stacked anyway by hands like aces or hands like queen jack, what are you doing slow playing your hand? Are you hoping to make that back by villain betting enough 5s here? The reason the solver likes slow playing the flop and will just check call down sometimes with hands like this is that it does expect random hands to barrel off. Okay, not random hands, but certain hands like jack 10, for example, maybe a hand that triple barrels off in GTO. Okay, we block that, blah, blah, blah. It doesn't matter. You get the point. There are hands that bluff here in GTO that don't bluff in the real world, and that's what we're concerned with in true EV. Queen jack of spades, opening the cutoff, called by the big blind, jack 4 deuce. We check back the flop here. This is a play, kind of a separate note, but this is a play I like to make against just bad poker players who I think are going to construct a turn probing range, right? Which is this note here, in a all over the place, careless, reckless way. And I think that's really, really common at low stakes and micro stakes as well, is that people are just betting when check to quite indiscriminately, quite merged, kind of without definition. And if you do c-bet, they're probably overfolding a bit and not raising you enough. So you actually get a bit less value with hands like this by c-betting flop, and you tend to do quite well against turn probes because they're just happening too frequently. You get money here from a lot of hands by checking that you don't by betting. So checking back this flop is fine, especially if you have a hand that isn't desperate to build a gigantic pot. Our hand on the flop here does want to pot build a bit, but it doesn't crave such a pot size that it needs to like bet really big immediately. So check is fine. We pot it here, slight under bet here. I think this is a good sizing elasticity wise, because what we're seeing with the sizing is I'm putting a lot of money into the pot without making it look like an overbet. And I think that humans are quite visual creatures. If you go 520 here, even though that's not much bigger than 468, it will be perceived to be quite a bit bigger than this. It's an overbet. It stands out as an overbet, and a lot of humans are going to notice that. So keeping your sizing just under pot here instead of just over when you're value betting, that makes a lot of sense, right? If you think there's going to be a spike in fold equity as you move to slight overbet. The other option is just to go like 10 or something and just say, well, I'm going to overbet, and I know my bet will be perceived as an overbet, but I want to put as much in as possible given that I'm value betting, and I don't think people will be reactive to sizing. Another thing you can say about humans is that they do a very bad job, me included, by the way, you included as well, of calibrating properly to changes in bet size. That's incredibly difficult to be precise about unless you're a solver. So this is going to be a decent sizing. And then on the river, because villain has called pot, they're going to have a queen really often. They're going to have a jack really often. They're just going to have good showdown value a lot. And they're going to be fairly inelastic to sizing on the river once again. And so going for a really big sizing here. Note this time, because I'm thinking in terms of true EV, and I'm saying, how is my opponent likely to react? Remember, it's about our hand against their range and strategy. How is their range and strategy likely to react to different sizes by us? And I think the answer is, once we go 21, I don't think it'll react differently to 27. They're either going to believe us or not in this case, and they're either going to want to bluff catch against a perceived overbet or not. Therefore, when you're bluffing, you should go 21, and when you're value betting, you should go 27. This sounds really crude, barbaric, caveman poker, but this is how you maximize against players that aren't incredibly strong. This is what you do. Secret will make you so much money. It's not even really a secret. This idea will make you way more money than getting really good at applying some solver strategy in some spot. That might make you no money. That might be terrible. That might actually be worse than just always going big or using a certain bet size. It's just a matter of thinking about your opponent's range, not your range, and your hand. If you can do that well, you can move up multiple stakes. You can get pretty far in this game. You don't need the really intricate strategic range construction on your own part until you're playing against really strong players. And even then, maybe there's an argument to game select better and not play against people that you feel you need to play that way against. Villain calls down with ace-jack, and really, this is not surprising because they've already made their intentions clear by calling the big turn bet. They've said, okay, I'm going to bluff catch here. I'm going to call this hand. So in the river, you're going to find that this is a really bad bluff size. This is not a good bluff size. If you want to bluff for an overbet, go 17. Save yourself 10 big blinds and your bet will be perceived similarly. Elasticity is so powerful. Use it. All right. I hope you've enjoyed the first episode of True EV. I've certainly liked making it. I have loads more ideas for what topics I'm going to be discussing. True EV is going to be a long series, guys. If you're a Carrot Corner subscriber, you have tons more of these to look forward to. And yeah, hope to speak to you in our Discord. Do let us know in the subscription library channel in there what kind of stuff you would like to see in future. Give me ideas for this series. And yeah, thank you so much for being a part of Carrot Corner. It means a lot to me, and I hope you're enjoying not just the content from me, but that from our other awesome coaches and professional poker players working for us as well. See you in the next video. And yeah, can't wait for the next part of this series. Let's go.